cancer is caused by food.
Really?
70%.
70% of cancer is caused by food.
And sugar is the #1 culprit. Heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, it's the big killers.
Are by sugar and food. So if you change your diet, you should be able to prevent
or cure sometimes. So now we're seeing 1 in 2 Americans suffer from either pre-diabetes
or type 2
diabetes. And that is when you eat too much sugar and starch. And every time you do that, it raises your insulin. Your body becomes resistant to the insulin, and so it doesn't work as well, so you need more insulin. And insulin does what? Insulin makes you hungry, it makes you store belly fat, it locks the fat in the fat cells, and it slows your metabolism. It's like a quadruple threat for your body to gain weight. So it's why we're seeing, and that goes back to what we're growing, right? So why are we eating all this food? It's because that's the food we produce, right? And so that's the other part of the problem. So we have the chronic disease, we have the economic impact, and then we're like, well, why do we have this food? So as a functional medicine doctor, I'm always asking why, right? Well, why are my patients sick?
Because it makes money, right?
Well, no, yeah, but I'm going even further. Why I got interested in this, because why would a doctor care about agriculture and soil and all this crap? Because as I was thinking about my patients' diseases, most of them were caused by food and can be cured by food. So I'm thinking, well, if it's
how many are most of them? Is this like 50%, 70%? 80% of anyone that comes into the hospital, or your patients, who has some type of disease or some type of sickness.
I mean, unless it's like an environmental thing like mercury or Lyme or mold, most of the things.
Or cancer.
Cancer is caused by food.
Really?
70%.
70% of cancer is caused by food.
And sugar is the #1 culprit. Heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, heart disease, the big killers.
Are by sugar and food.
Yes. Yes.
So if you change your diet, you should be able to prevent
or cure sometimes.
Sometimes cure. Depends how far along things are, I guess.
Yeah.
But you can prevent heart disease, Alzheimer's.
100%. Yes, 100%. I mean, the studies are there.
It's crazy.
Even people who already have Alzheimer's, when they improve their diet, they can wake up
more
and get
functionality back.
So you've got me thinking, okay, well, if the patient's disease are caused by food, what's causing the food? It's the food system. And I'm like, well, what's causing the food system? It's our food policies. Like, what's causing our food policies? It's the food industry that's lobbying Congress.
It's got money.
It's the biggest lobby group in Congress is agriculture and food. By far, like by twice as much as the next lobby group.
By like gas and oil or whatever.
Yeah, exactly, right. And it's like, what? So then I began thinking, well, if I'm going to help my patients, I can't do it in my office. Like I can, it's like I'm like in the boat, bailing the boat with a hole instead of plugging the hole.
Right. You're not going to the source.
Right. So then I'm thinking, okay, well, what do I need to do as a functional medicine doctor? I need to go to the root cause, right? The root cause and why. And then it became clear to me that it's our agricultural system that's driving so much of the problem. And what we grow has been based on good intentions that we're in the 50s and people were hungry. There wasn't enough food. There was a lot of poverty. And so we figured out a system to produce an abundance of starchy calories.
So we can have food.
So we can have food. And we were great at it. And we have cheap, abundant corn and wheat and soy, which are the commodity crops that are turned into industrial processed food, which is now 60% of our diet. And for every 10% of that you eat, your risk of death goes up by 14%.
Shut up.
Yeah, so you're
crazy.
So you're basically, feeding Americans a diet we know is going to kill them. The research is so clear on this. There's no scientific debate, and yet we don't do anything about it because we have these dysfunctional food policies. And then the way we grow the food causes climate change, and we'll get into that. But the #1 cause of climate change is our food system.
Really?
People don't realize that. I didn't know it. I'm like, it's oil and gas and all this stuff. I'm like,
but what is it? Is it the trucking? Is it the animal feces?
End to end.
Is it
so first of all, deforestation is devastating. Not only do we destroy the soil on which we cut down the trees, but the trees are carbon sinks, so we lose that.
So they're not sucking in the bad air.
They're sucking
putting
in
out
carbon
good
dioxide, right? I mean, basically, plants suck out carbon dioxide. That's what they breathe. We breathe oxygen; they breathe carbon dioxide. So that's a perfect antidote, right? Yeah. And then the soil also we're damaging by the way we're farming. We've lost 1/3 of our topsoil. It's responsible, and people don't know this, but of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the loss of soil, organic matter, like healthy, rich soil, is responsible for 30 to 40% of all greenhouse gases currently in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution.
Does that mean, why is that? Does it
why?
suck up? Does it suck?
Because soil it can hold more carbon than is in the atmosphere right now. There's 1 trillion tons of carbon in the atmosphere, which is a lot. I don't know, 1 trillion tons, I don't even know how to measure that. And the soil can hold 3 trillion tons of carbon. And how does it do that? It's an ancient carbon capture technology that is available all over the world, that's free that's can be more effective than all the rainforests on the planet, than all the forests and trees on the planet. It's called photosynthesis. And if you have like grasslands, for example, like we had big prairies in the United States, they suck down carbon, they breathe it, and they put it through the plants into the roots, feeds the mycorrhizal fungi, which then make healthy soil, feeds the bacteria, and you get this incredibly rich live soil that holds tremendous amounts of organic matter that is carbon, right? I mean, carbohydrates comes from the word carbon, which comes from carbon dioxide, right? Ding, 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 it all connects. And,
interesting.
And so we've lost. So
if we don't have the soil for it to consume, then it just bounces off back into the air, I guess, and we're just consuming it in other ways.
Yeah, and the soil can hold so much carbon. The UN estimated that if we took the 5 million hectares of degraded farmland around the world, if we took just 2 million of that and spent 300 billion, which is the total military spend for 60 days around the world, which is not much. 60 days, 2 months of everybody's military spending. We literally could stall climate change by 20 years.
Wow.
Because of putting back the carbon in the soil. And not only that, it holds water. You see, in Iowa and in the Midwest, there was floods that just destroyed 1 million acres of cropland that otherwise could have been fine if the soil could hold the water, but it just sits on the top where it runs through, and we lose all this water. So that when you have organic matter in the soil, it holds 27,000 gallons for every 1% organic matter in the soil per acre. So it's an incredible water sink, it's a carbon sink, and we've lost all these soils, and it's because we're growing these commodity crops in ways that destroy soil. We're tilling the soil, we're turning over soil erosion, it runs off into the rivers. We kill all the life in the organic matter by poisoning it with fertilizer, with pesticides, with glyphosate, herbicides, and it's staggering. And then we have all these sort of unintended consequences. We started growing all this food, and we thought this agricultural revolution was great. All these chemicals are great. Fertilizer's great. We can do all this good stuff. Tractors, big farms, more food, feed the world. It's backfired on us, and it's producing the worst food on the planet. That's causing devastating environmental damage, staggering climate change. So it's the soil loss, it's, you said, the deforestation, it's the factory farming of animals, which should be banned. It's the transportation, storage, refrigeration, and the food waste. I mean, food waste a
lot of waste.
Yeah, but we waste 40% of our food. We really
That's on our plate. We don't eat it.
Imagine going to the grocery store, buying a bunch of groceries, and getting home and throwing 40% in the garbage. The average Americans waste $1,800 of food a year, and it's about a pound a day, and that goes to landfills. The landfills, then it rots and creates methane. So you could be a vegan throwing out your food waste and scraps, and you could be contributing to climate change. If food waste were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases after the US and China.
Wow.
Yeah, it's methane to produce, and we need to compost, we need to have community garden, like always to fix it. But it's like when you look at the whole end-to-end food system, it is the #1 source of climate change, about 50% of greenhouse gases. And people just don't appreciate that.
So why, if this information is public and it's out there and policy makers are aware of it, they're not aware of it.
No. I spent 2 hours on a sailboat this summer with a senator, a smart senator.
He wasn't aware of it.
And I literally, his jaw was hanging open the entire time.
Are they not presented with this research and information?
No, because
they got so much money sent to them by the lobbyists, probably.
Right. I mean, listen, if all the people who are walking their office are Monsanto and Cargill and McDonald's and Pepsi and they're all donating millions of dollars, I would say billions of dollars, they're not hearing the other side of the science. And how do you fight that? So I always should deride at lobbyists, but I plan on creating a food fix campaign, which is a nonprofit, along with an advocacy organization, to start to literally lobby senators, congressmen, key people in the administration around these issues and start to drive policy change.
Because in the UK, and you were talking about, I think in Australia, New Zealand, or in I think in Asia, you were saying that you can't do certain things with the food, otherwise you'll go to prison, you'll go to, you'll get killed,
I mean,
like in the UK, they don't have a lot of these dyes, right?
Yeah, so it's so funny, the FDA, is so influenced by the food industry, and I was once with the former head of the Federal Drug Administration, Food and Drug Administration, Peggy Hammer. Former. She was, but then she was the FDA commissioner.
Yeah.
But now she's former. And I was at the World Economic Forum. I said, Peggy, how come we have so much trouble with getting advances in food labeling or dealing with toxic chemicals in our food or the antibiotics in animal feed or she's like, well, when we try to make too aggressive change, Congress threatens to shut down our funding because of the food lobby.
They threaten to shut it down?
Yeah.
And then what? If they shut it down, what would happen?
Well, they're limited in their ability to do their job. And so the FTC, the same thing happened. In the 70s, there was a movement by the Federal Trade Commission to have, negative, education campaigns around sugar and how bad it was. But the Congress says, we're going to pull all your funding and shut you down if you do this. And so they pull back. So for example, you asked a question about Asia. We have this thing called GRAS, which is generally recognized as safe. So the food additives. We have thousands of food additives. Only about 5% have actually been tested for safety.
In the U.S.
Some of them are grandfathered in, right? Like so Crisco, for example, trans fat was grandfathered in as a safe food to eat. But it took 50 years for researchers to finally prove to the FDA that it wasn't safe because it was the basis of all processed food, right? Crisco shortening. It shortens your life. That's what I call it.
Oh my gosh.
And so they literally had to be sued by a scientist in order to actually turn it into a non-safe substance. And then, of course, they gave the food industry years and years to get it out of the food. So it's, but in this country, there's so many things that are used in our food supply that are banned in Europe, like BHT, butylated hydroxytoluene, food additives, various dyes, and something called azodicarbonamide, which is a softener that makes like bread more like fluffy and soft. And it was used in Subway sandwiches. Our friend Vani Hari outed them and said, this is your yoga mat material in your Subway sandwich.
And they got it taken out,
pretended to eat her, and she got it out. But the FDA still says it's fine to eat.
Right.
And in Singapore, if you use it and you're a food producer, you get a $450,000 fine and 15 years in jail for putting it in the food.
That same ingredient.
The same ingredient.
That anyone can use in the U.S. right now.
In the U.S., yes. And most of the things that are safe, quote, safe here are banned in Europe. So it's like, yeah, they're not doing their job. And then antibiotics, we have 30 million pounds of antibiotics that are used in animal feed. We have about 37 million total. So about 7 million for humans to treat disease and 30 million for animals. Why? For growth. It's a growth factor.
Right.
It makes them fat. And it makes humans fat too. And it is used for prevention from overcrowding. And the FDA says, well, this isn't a good idea. I mean, nobody thinks it's a good idea. Mm-hmm. But they go, well, would you pretty please not do it? It was a voluntary guideline that the FDA produced, not mandatory.
Please don't do it, yeah.
You have to have a vet certify that the animal's sick before you give them antibiotics.
Oh, man.
And now they continue to do it and just laugh. They had voluntary, the FTC put in voluntary guidelines around junk food marketing. Would you pretty please not advertise the bad stuff and advertise more good stuff? It was just voluntary, and the food industry went ballistic and had it overturned. So even the voluntary guidelines are nullified.
Like, no, wow.
And
sugar, it's like, I'm the first one to raise my hand when I say, like, I love sugar. And it's my biggest vice, right?
Everybody
I love cookies and candies and cakes and brownies and anything you can think of, I love it, right?
We programmed
I don't know why I don't have diabetes. So much sugar I've had my whole life. But
you can't be having that much because you look pretty good.
Well, I train hard too, right? I go through waves. But as a kid, I would drink like 9, 10 Dr. Peppers a day, I remember.
What?
Like some days in the summer, you're just sitting around.
You could have been president. Isn't that what our president?
Exactly. But I would run around and work out and play sports, but then I would just drink because I thought that's what was on TV.
You were 16, 18. You're like.
No, I was like 9, 10, right? So I was like, but it was, you'd see it on commercials like your NBA superstar drinking Dr. Pepper or Sprite or whatever on the basketball court. And I don't know if it was just like subconscious or just it tasted good and you didn't think about it.
I mean, this is where the food industry is so, I mean, I talk about it in my book, Food Fix, but the food industry is so strategic about how it advances its mission and goals. And it does it through multiple channels. And I'm just going to go through them because people just don't know.
The celebrity endorsements, right?
Yeah, first, obviously, celebrity endorsements, which is the obvious one. They co-opt social groups. So they fund groups like the NAACP and Hispanic Federation. The African American and Latino communities are the most affected by diabetes and obesity, and they co-opt them by funding them. I want to show the movie Fed Up at the King Center in Atlanta, and Bernice King, Martin Luther King's daughter, was all about it, and she was excited. But once we got it scheduled, a few days later, I got a call that we couldn't show it. I'm like, why? She says, because Coca-Cola funds the King Center.
No.
Yeah. I went to Spelman College, which is African American Women College in Atlanta, and the dean said to me, half of the 18-year-olds coming into college have a chronic illness, obesity, hypertension, diabetes. 18-year-old women. And I'm like, why is there soda machines all over the campus? Why? It's just because Coke funds.
No.
And one of the people on the board of trustees is one of the highest executives at Coca-Cola.
Oh man.
An African American woman. It's like, so they co-opt social groups. And that's why they, for example, oppose soda taxes, because they're in the funding of these big soda companies. And then, of course, they fund research. So they fund 12 times as much research, $12 billion worth of research a year to study nutrition. So Gatorade gets studied by Pepsi.
Really?
Gatorade's the best thing in the world. It's not. It's just sugar, right? Or
right.
So it corrupts and pollutes science. So people are confused. Why is there so much confusion about nutrition science? Third, they create front groups. They call them spin doctors. So they create front groups that seem like they're independent groups, like Crop Life.
Yeah.
Or like
and they're tweeting
the Center for Consumer Freedom.
Right.
Or the American Council on Science and Health, which, by the way, is run by a bunch of doctors who suggest that pesticides are safe, that high fructose corn is great for you, that smoking doesn't cause disease, and
why would they do that? Because they get paid a lot?
They're funded by Monsanto and Big Food and Pepsi. You just look at their funders, and they spend $30 million fighting GMO labeling in California. This front group, it was all funded by Monsanto, right? And then you got these front groups, and then you have them co-opting scientists and academies. So the nutrition academies, the American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association, their funding in large part comes from industry. And so the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is our main nutrition association, 40% of their funding comes from the food industry. They have sponsored, lectures at their meetings that are, with people saying, well, high fructose corn syrup is good and diet drinks are good, and
right.
It's just completely corrupted. And so these professional societies give guidelines, and they're corrupt. And Dr. Ioannidis from Stanford, who's a scientist who looks carefully at the research and conflicts of interest, says, these professional societies like the American Heart Association and Diabetes Association should not be making guidelines. And then, so you've got all these ways in which they sort of screw things up. And then, of course, they are aggressive in advertising and marketing, which is illegal in most countries. And then they have lobbyists running around Washington driving policy that supports all of what they do. So you've got this massive effort, and it's often subversive and illegal. And it's kind of shady.
Yeah.
I mean, here's an example. Like in California, there was a group that wanted to have to promote GMO labeling, and they put in a ballot on the.
What does that mean, promote GMO labeling?
So that you have to label, if you have a food that has GMO in it, you have to label it.
Yeah.
So on can of Coca-Cola it would say GMO corn, right?
Kind of like in a cigarette box where it says like this will kill you.
Right, and your plant-based burger would have to say GMO burger, right?
Right.
So the food industry didn't like that. So the grocery manufacturers of America got together because it would really cost them, huge amounts of money. People were aware of this stuff. They don't want to.
They stopped buying it.
Yeah. And by the way,
why don't they label it though? That seems like the smart thing to do.
By the way, most countries do have it.
Really?
I think 30 to 50 countries have it, including China and Russia, which are not known for transparency or democracy, right? So it's terrible. So they basically tried to put this thing. Now the food industry got together with the Grocery Manufacturers of America, which is their trade group. And they're like, we can't have this. So they spent like millions and millions of dollars fighting this ballot. And the way they did it was illegal. because they got the food companies to donate in a way where it should be transparent for campaign finance. You have to be all transparent. It was all secret. They got caught. The grocery manufacturers of America got fined $18 million, which is the largest fine ever for an infraction for campaign finance violations. But they appealed it, and it was down to $6 million, and then appealed. But it's like, and of course the ballot, because they did all that work, it didn't pass. So they were successful. So what's a few $1 million when they have billions at stake? So they're so corrupt. And then in California, it was even worse. There were 4 soda taxes passed here in the 2016 election. In many states.
Soda tax
in many
is
states,
passed.
it's soda tax, right? So you pay an extra penny an ounce, or whatever, for sugar sweetened drink, which, by the way, it's been proven to reduce consumption dramatically. It works. That's why people do it, and it works, and that's why the food industry is so against it. So what the American Beverage Association, which used to be called the American Soda Pop Association, did was they took, and this is crazy, they created a ballot measure to prohibit any local taxes from being passed unless there was a 2/3 majority, which would mean that you couldn't fund schools, police stations, fire stations, local stuff, and it would have crippled local governments all across the state. It had nothing to do with food. But then they went at the last minute before it was about to pass, and they spent millions pushing this. They went to Governor Jerry Brown, the most liberal governor we probably ever had in America, Governor Moonbeam they used to call him. And they're like, look, you pull this, you pass this preemptive law, which means you can never pass another soda tax in California, and we'll pull this ballot measure. So basically they got Governor Brown to pass this preemptive law, which means that you're not allowed to go and pass another soda tax in California.
Why?
Why? Because they don't want soda taxes.
It's crazy.
It's crazy. And why did Governor Brown do it? Because he didn't want his entire state, local governments to be crippled by this new ballot measure that was about to pass. So it was all done behind closed doors.
You can never tax again?
You can't now in California.
You can't?
No, and they're doing this states
Can you change the law back?
You could.
It'll just take more effort and energy.
They're going to have to, but they're doing this in states all across the country.
Gosh.
And it's the playbook that the tobacco industry used.
Isn't tobacco, isn't cigarettes have a tax on them now, or in some states?
They do.
Where it's
There was a huge lawsuit that sort of changed everything, right? There was huge litigation and multi-billion-dollar settlements and all kinds of restrictions. That did happen. But food is more complicated because it's not cigarette is one thing. It's like soda, it's processed food, it's everything. So this is all the bad news. The good news is that we can fix these problems. We can reverse climate change. We can reverse chronic disease. We can fix these dysfunctional food policies. We can end some of the social injustice issues, which we didn't talk about as related to food. We can actually help save our economy if we change the way we grow food, the way we process food, the way we distribute, market it, eat it, and waste it. And we can do that. It's not like we need to invent some new technology. We have the ability to do it. We know what to do. The science is there. It just is going to take a grassroots movement and some political pressure to do it.
What would be the first steps that someone could take to help?
Well, I think, in my
it seems like such a big...
It is. It's a little big... So let's talk about some of the solutions. So we know, food is causing chronic disease. It's destroying our economy. It's crippling our climate. It's destroying our environment and killing all the pollinators and all biodiversity. And it's causing social injustice because it targets poor minorities who suffer from problems. It prevents kids from learning in school because they're eating all this crap. It threatens our national security. It creates political instability. So we know all these things. But the good news is that by fixing the food system, we can solve these. And how do we do it? Well, it's going to need citizen action. It's going to need business innovation. And it's going to need policy change. And of course, other philanthropists and governments to help get on board. And I think that's what's really exciting to me because there's so much hope. So for example, on a personal level, you can shift what you eat and what you do to drive change in the marketplace. Why are companies like Nestle and Unilever and Danone creating regenerative ag programs within their supply chain? Why are they trying to up the quality of their food and take out chemicals? Because consumers are demanding it.
Well, they're buying companies like Primal Kitchen that have like
Kraft, bought Primal Kitchen, which is basically a Whole Foods, really high quality, nutritious product with no junk in it.
Exactly.
Right. So there's and yes, that's part of the problem. They're buying up these companies, but I think they're seeing the change, and there's a positive change. I mean, General Mills just committed 1 million acres to regenerative agriculture. That's incredible. That happened because people are demanding different things by voting with their fork, voting with their wallet. What do we know about how to create immunoresilience, how to create immunorejuvenation, how to make ourselves an unfriendly host to the microbes that we're exposed to? Because we're all exposed to them, right?
Yes.
I mean, people with AIDS don't die from the HIV virus. The HIV virus cripples their immune system. Yes. Which means that they are going to die from things that we all live with in our bodies, whether it's pneumocystis pneumonia, or whether it's cytomegalovirus, or whether it's, a different bacteria like Mycobacterium avium tuberculosis. So like we actually are living in a soup of bugs that live in us all the time.
Yes.
And it's not a bad thing. We're just in balance with them. And so when we get out of balance, whether it's a virus like HIV hijacking our immune system, or whether it's the fact that we have a crappy diet and are stressed and don't sleep and have nutrient deficiencies and, don't take care of ourselves, well, there's a lot we can do about it. And that's what's so great about functional medicine is it gives us a method of evaluating people and where they break down and where they're struggling and where their immune system might not be working optimally. And there's so many different reasons for it. And we're going to get into that in today's podcast. So tell us, Liz, about some of your patients that you've discovered how to actually work with it. Because it's something I also have seen in my practice. People get sick over and over again. And you're just going to see these people like, why are you always getting sick? And then you start digging and what are the kinds of things you find?
What are out of balance? What's out of balance? So for the first person I wanted to talk about, he was a 10-year-old boy, and he was coming in because he was getting every cold and flu that was going around, right? So his mom was getting frustrated because he was out of school almost a couple weeks a year, if not more, because he kept getting sick. And she of course had to take off work, and it was causing some disruption in their house. But she was also really just worried about him. Why was he picking up every cold and flu going around? I got a good detailed history from him, and he had multiple ear infections as a younger child. So when he was, his first few years of life, even up to 5, he was getting lots of ear infections, and often treated with antibiotics, right? So he would get an ear infection and he would take antibiotics, and then he would get another ear infection and he would take more antibiotics. He had a lot of congestion in his nose and
I mean, even when he wasn't sick.
Even when he wasn't sick, he was dealing with and that's an issue, we know, because when there's a lot of congestion floating around, sometimes it gets stuck, right? So kids that have a lot of congestion in their nasal passageways and their eustachian tubes, more likely for it to get, they have more inflammation, and it's more likely to get stuck, and then another infection grows and you get an ear infection, for example. So he had these recurrent chronic ear infections.
So this is just to break it down a little bit. So what you're saying is essentially is that if you're living a lifestyle or you have food sensitivities or something that's causing congestion and inflammation in your sinuses and your nose and your throat, that sets the stage for recurring infections.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe the treatment isn't to fix the infection; it's to figure out why there's this problem.
Right, because the congestion gets stuck, and then it's a breeding ground for a virus or bacteria to overgrow and an infection to take hold, and for it not to be able to get out of the system. And for him, he had these chronic ear infections, but now is getting everything. But so when he had the chronic ear infections, it's important to note that he was given lots of antibiotics. So for his first 5 years of life, he was on multiple rounds of antibiotics, 2-3 times a year, getting antibiotics for these ear infections. And that is something we often see, right? We'll see that somebody gets an infection, right? For this kid, it was his ear infection, or for somebody else, it might be a urinary tract infection or a sinus infection. They are given antibiotics, but those antibiotics get rid of the infection, but they also can get rid of all that good bacteria that's lining the sinus passageways, the digestive system, the bladder area, right?
The microbiome.
So the microbiome, right? So, and we know that those good bacteria, they're like the first line of defense. They're like that army on the front line, right? They can say, okay, virus, don't get into my body. Okay, another bacteria, don't come into my nose, right? Those good bacteria are lining all the passageways in our body, so that when
they're part of our defense system.
Huge part of our immune system, huge part of that innate immune system, that immune system that's gonna attack right away when something new or different comes into the body. And so when we've been on a lot of antibiotics in the past, we will often see people's whose immune system is not working as well as we'd like it to. So, I think
what you're saying is that antibiotics, even though they treat infections, seem to mess up your immune system.
I think they do. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's good studies to show that when you get, I mean, sometimes an antibiotic is necessary, but there's definitely been multiple times with lots and lots of people, and of course all the antibiotics in our food supply, they're damaging a lot of that good protective, good bacteria that are first line of our immune system. So absolutely.
And then it makes you even more susceptible on the next round.
Exactly. And that's, I think, one reason why we see these chronic infections with people, because they take the antibiotics, but then it gets rid of a lot of the good bacteria. So it's easier then next time for that virus or bacteria to take hold and to become an infection again. And so we see this sort of cyclical thing going on with people. And so I think that's important for us to pay attention to and say, okay, let's step back and say, do we absolutely need to use this antibiotic this time for this situation?
Yeah.
And I think we as physicians, it's important that we are making that, we're being more careful with the use of antibiotics. Sure. But I think that's an area that we see issue with. And I think one reason for him, one of the reasons why he was more susceptible to these colds and flus. But I don't think it was the only reason.
Yeah, what was the other thing
And I
you
think
found?
that's important to note, right? We always want to find one thing. We always want to say, oh, it's the one reason why somebody's immune system isn't working as well. But many times it's multiple things coming together.
And just want to stop you for a minute there, because in traditional medicine, we were trained to think about the one thing.
Yeah.
We call it Occam's razor. What's the simplest explanation that can explain all of it? And we sort of do that a little bit in functional medicine, but the problem with traditional medicine is very reductionist. It's like this, this is one thing. And the truth isn't, body is complex. It is a system.
Yes.
And it's many things. It's more like a web than a razor.
Absolutely. Right. And many times there's, 10 different things going on that are contributing to why this person's immune system wasn't working
well. So their microbiome,
well.
their diet, nutritional deficiencies, all sorts of things.
So for this child, we realized also, because of all of this congestion and frequent infections and a lot of ear infections as a kid, I said, well, you know what? Maybe we need to think about some food sensitivities that may be causing a lot of congestion for this kid and putting him at increased risk for these ear infections as a kid and infections now. Because we do know that dairy and cow's milk is associated with increased risk of ear infections for some kids.
And also mucus production, congestion. I mean, I know if I eat dairy, I might immediately get runny nose and congestion.
Yeah.
It doesn't affect everybody by that way, but it does affect a lot of people that way.
Yep. And he was willing to say, okay, I'm gonna, the kid, he was ready to say, I want to stop getting sick all the time. And so he was willing to go off of, to do an elimination of dairy from his diet. And so that is one of the things we really focused on and we worked on. And it really did help. His congestion decreased. He wasn't getting as sick as much, but we did more than that, because we also realized that he, I did some nutritional biomarkers. I realized he was a little low in zinc, which is, not uncommon to find, so
zinc is so important for your immune function. In fact, in COVID-19, they're finding they're actually treating patients with zinc because it helps to interrupt the viral replication and the viral binding to this sort of cells and the insertion into the host DNA. So I think it's really interesting to see that, just even in this crazy, horrible infection of COVID-19, we're going back to basic principles of what's required to help the immune system. Zinc and vitamin C, which are being even used intravenously in studies.
Yes. And so for him, we added in like 20 milligrams of zinc and 500 milligrams of vitamin C a day. And that was very helpful too, to help him break this cycle. In addition, we found out that he had some elevated levels of heavy metals. So his lead was a little bit high. He was living in a home. He'd grown up in a home that was it was built in the early 1920s or so. So it had more just lead in the water and in the walls of the house. So I mean, it had been refurbished, but it's still, his lead levels were higher than we'd like them to be. And we know, right, what we know about heavy metals, we know that high levels of lead are really a problem for both the neurological system and the immune system. But I think we also know that, low levels can result in people's immune systems not working optimally.
Yeah, and also mercury and lead also affect the gut. So they interrupt the gut function, can cause leaky gut, growth of bad bugs in there. So you've got other reasons for this.
Yes. Right. That's true. That's very true. So we also, not only did we pull away dairy from his diet, we put him on a really good probiotic because he had been on so many antibiotics in the past. And probiotics, there's really, really interesting studies on how well they help the immune system. I mean, we need to do a lot more research here and figure this out a lot more, but they can really help with breaking some of the cycles for people who are chronically getting sick.
I mean, I remember the study I read years ago. It was a pregnant woman who took probiotics, and compared to another group that didn't. And the women who took the probiotics during pregnancy, their offspring had dramatically less eczema and asthma.
Yes.
And allergies.
Yes.
Because the mothers took it. So same thing when you give it to kids, it also helps dramatically with these problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And can help it can help improve the functioning of the immune system for some kids in certain situations. And then of course we gave him that zinc and vitamin C, but then I put him on a detoxification protocol. I really helped with getting these heavy metal levels down. We did a protocol that had multiple different components in it. But that was because we tested and we found that his heavy metals were a little bit high. So we worked to really bring them down with glutathione, liposomal vitamin C, some binding agents, things that help support the detoxification system in his body. And, that comprehensive approach really helped his immune system improve. And it helped him get out of that cycle of getting sick, 2 to 3 times every winter. And I think it's really fun to watch and see that because we
I hear
see
there's
that
somebody,
difference all the
Dr.
time.
Hyman, I don't get sick anymore. My sinuses, I don't get, this is the first year I've gone without having antibiotics for my sinuses.
I know,
and so
right?
forth. It's just it's so simple. I mean, I remember this kid, just reminded me of this story when I was in the emergency room years ago, and I was working at Mercy Hospital in Springfield, Mass. And this woman came in with her toddler, who was probably like maybe about 2 years old, and had just so many ear infections, one after the other after the other. And I said, well, when did this all start? And she's like, well, when he was about 1 year old. I said, what happened when he was 1 year old? She said, well, I switched him from breast milk to regular milk. And I was like, and this is before I knew about functional medicine or anything. I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. Well, why don't you take him off dairy and see what happens? And the kid was fine. So I think sometimes it's sort of that simple, but I think often it's more comprehensive because you change his diet, you optimize his nutrient levels, and you also went a little deeper to look at his detoxification and his metal burden, which is also a factor. So you did diagnostic tests that can help pinpoint these issues, and you can really create a precision approach to each individual. So this is his problem, but there may be somebody else who might have a different reason for their immune system not working. And I think it's really important to understand that we at the UltraWellness Center and in functional medicine take a very different lens at looking at these chronic problems and say, what is the cause? How do we get rid of the cause? And why isn't the body working properly? And when I learned functional medicine, one of my mentors was a guy named Sidney Baker, who was sort of a Yale pediatrician, just brilliant guy. And he was incredibly good at taking incredibly complex ideas and simplifying them into a few principles. And one of the most important principles that guides me every day, still today, is a very simple question: is what do you need to get rid of in your body that's making it unhappy? And what does your body need to get in order to get healthy?
Yes. So
what are the things that are the problems that cause disease? And what are the missing factors that you need to have a resilient system? And so this is for the immune system. Saying, so this kid, he had too much dairy that was bugging him. He had too many metals that were bugging him. So you got rid of those things. And then you added in the things body needed to function. You added in the probiotics and you added in the zinc and the vitamin C. And the body knows what to do. It's like when you take out the bad stuff, you put in the good stuff. It's just that simple. And sometimes it's a tough job to figure out what the bad stuff is that you need to get rid of and what the good stuff is you need to get. And that's where the real meat of functional medicine is being able to investigate those things properly.
Figure that out, right?
And we don't learn that in medical school. And so functional medicine, we learn how to dive deep into being an expert in what are the things that cause disease and how do you create a healthy human.
And I think that's really the power of supplements. Sometimes people are like, oh, what does supplements matter? A multi, is this helpful? Is this helpful?
Expensive urine.
Yeah, but when you can identify what deficiencies people have or what, because of their genetics, they need more of, right? When you can really specialize and give a personalized program for somebody, it makes a world of difference. I remember I remember in my undergraduate degree in nutrition, and they were just like, oh, don't bother with supplements. It was really food first kind of a program. So I never took supplements. I remember the first time I took a multivitamin, I was like, whoa, this is amazing. And it was a good quality one with good methylated B vitamins. I had so much more energy because I needed that extra methylation because of my genetics, right? But so when you specialize and give a personalized approach, it really makes a huge difference for people.
So key. So basically what you're saying is that fat around your belly is not just holding up your pants, that it's an immunologically active organ.
Yep.
It produces these molecules we call adipose cytokines. You've heard of the cytokine storm with COVID.
Yep.
Well, it's that same chronic cytokine storm that's being released from these fat cells in your belly. They're not just average. I mean, you have fat in your legs or your butt. Yep. It's not going to do that. These fat cells in your belly are super inflammatory. So then you get the inflammation, which leads to oxidative stress, which then causes what problem with the cholesterol?
Right. So when your LDL cholesterol gets oxidized.
And what is that?
Think of oxidative stress like excessive free radicals or rusting in the body. But, we're always making free radicals when in many different cellular processes in the body. But when there's too many of them, or you don't have enough antioxidants to squelch that those free radicals. So if your diet's not rich enough in the polyphenols or those phytonutrients or your vegetables, then what happens is you get more oxidative stress, and that oxidative stress can shift that LDL cholesterol, and it's that oxidized LDL that's more damaging and more likely to cause plaque buildup and that will lead to heart disease.
So it's basically rancid cholesterol
Yep.
in your bloodstream that's the problem. That gets oxidized, which is like you said, rusting or apple turning brown or your skin wrinkling from too much sun. These are all signs of oxidative. But this happens inside of you, and it leads to this inflammatory process, this oxidative stress, and that's what causes the heart disease. And some of the interesting studies I've seen, like the Jupiter study, very big trial from Harvard on heart disease. It's fascinating to me that people who had high LDL but no inflammation had very low risk.
Yes.
People who had high inflammation but kind of okay cholesterol, they were at risk. And those with high cholesterol and high inflammation had the most risk. Yes. So I think we have to be focused on inflammation, what's causing that. And it may be that, the statin drugs, turns out, the benefits may not have a lot to do with cholesterol lowering.
But they're anti-inflammatory.
They're very powerful anti-inflammatory drugs, which is quote a side effect.
Yep.
But it actually works. Now, there's a lot of better ways to get rid of inflammation besides taking statin drugs. And so when you're talking about people's cholesterol, how do you decide, what to do for each patient? How do you decide from a functional medicine perspective, how to work these patients up to decide whether that should go on a drug or whether you just do lifestyle? How do you figure that out?
I mean, it is a complex process, right? Where we're taking a really detailed history and we're looking at more than just those numbers. We're looking at what are their markers of oxidative stress. We can measure those. We can measure oxidized LDL. We can measure 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine and lipid peroxides. All of these biomarkers that give us a sense of, is there oxidative stress?
And by the way, these kinds of tests are not things you'll typically get at your regular doctor. At the UltraWellness Center here in Lenox, Massachusetts, we do functional medicine, which takes a deeper dive into the root causes, into these diagnostic tests, which are not available usually through your nutritional doctor. They may not be interested in or know what to do or how to interpret, even fasting insulin, which they don't even do. So we really are excited to help people figure out how to look at their risk and design a strategy that's personalized for them using functional medicine. And we see people from all over the world at the UltraWellness Center doing like Zoom consults now. So it's pretty easy to get access.
And it's fascinating because there's so many pieces to the puzzle. And so when you find somebody with high oxidative stress, you ask that question, why? Why is there high oxidative stress? Is it their poor diet? Is it inflammation? Is it
their microbiome?
Is it their microbiome? Is it a toxin?
Heavy metals,
like a toxin or some
pollution.
Yes.
All this smoke that the wildfires in California, that increases risk of cardiovascular disease.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, it's really important to think about all the different things that can lead to oxidative stress and inflammation, and then try to tease out what is it for that individual person that we need to focus on. So I think that's important for some people, and a lot of Americans, there's so much that's lifestyle related, right? But for some people, their lifestyle is great, and it's more toxin related, that we really need to work on that. Or like you mentioned, the microbiome is an area that's fascinating, and we're learning so much about how it influences inflammation in the body.
Yeah.
Microbiome in your gut as well as microbiome in your mouth, right? And gingivitis, and how much that we've known for years that impacts risk of heart disease because of its inflammatory properties. So those are important things that we need to really investigate and look at.
Yeah, so true. I'm just thinking about, how we work with these patients. So we look at all these diagnostic tests that may not be looked at. We look at their overall cardiovascular risk, their family history. We may look at diagnostic tests. We may send them for a heart scan, look at calcium, carotid ultrasound, look at particle size, look at inflammation markers, oxidative stress markers, the microbiome, heavy metals. We might look at other factors like homocysteine, which looks at B vitamin status. We look at lipoprotein A and a bunch of other factors that give us a more rounded picture of what's going on. So we're not just focused like a laser on cholesterol. And the reason, it seems to me, that we are so hyper-focused on cholesterol is we have a good drug to treat it, right? So it's all pharmaceutical driven, whereas when you look at the data, 2/3 of all people entering into an emergency room with a heart attack have either prediabetes or diabetes, and most of them are undiagnosed.
Right. So when you say...
So if 2/3 of heart attacks are from sugar, not cholesterol issues, and we're just focusing on cholesterol, it seems like we're missing the mark here.
We often are. And when we're saying, okay, this is high, I mean, so many people come back with, high on their lab work, and it doesn't necessarily, like you said, mean it's anything to be concerned about.
Right.
And then there's so many people who come back without that that high level, and they do need to be concerned.
Statins have a role, but let's talk about the statins for a minute, because it's very controversial. Like any drug, there are benefits, there are risks, there are side effects, and there's the right patient for the job, right? So how do you come to sort of decide what you should do with a patient?
Yeah, I mean, you really want to get a good detailed family history. I think that there are some people who are at very high risk of vascular disease. And for people who have a strong family history, which means that if you have a first degree relative, which would be a parent or a sibling who has had an early heart attack. So for a man less than 55 or a woman less than 65, that means they've had diagnosed heart disease because of plaque at an early age. That those people who have that type of family history need to be more careful.
Or were they smokers? Were they very overweight? Did they have diabetes? Like, what are the other factors? So I always look at that as well, because
you have to.
I remember my grandfather, everybody in his family, like I think he had 9 siblings, everybody had heart attacks in their 50s. They all had bypasses, heart attacks, and they weren't like significantly overweight, but they were pretty high risk as a family. And he was deaf, so he couldn't hear. So he really couldn't get a job, like a white collar job. So he had a blue collar job, which was basically loading New York Times, big bundles of New York Times onto the trucks from the conveyor belt. So he was constantly working out all day long and was very, very strong and healthy. And every night he would go out in Queens and he would walk down the street and feed all the alley cats. So he walked every night after dinner, which we now know is a very good way to improve your health. And he didn't really get heart disease until his 80s. Right. And they all got it in their 50s. So it's, and his diet wasn't the best, right? But still, even with simple lifestyle things, it can make a big difference.
Absolutely. So, right. So you bring up a great point that genetics and family history is just one piece of the puzzle. It's not what makes us make all the decisions in the world, but we take that into account, as well as all their other risk factors, like you mentioned, like type 2 diabetes, and are they a smoker? And, so we really have to pay attention to all of those lifestyle factors.
And high blood pressure, a lot of high blood pressure is a big factor in heart disease. But again, high blood pressure is usually caused by the same thing, which is insulin resistance.
So often.
Sleep apnea. Yeah, it's very, very common.
Yep.
And I just sort of recall a patient. I'd love to hear any cases you'd like to share. But I just remembered a patient I saw was about 50 years old, and he came to see me. And he had a little bit of belly fat, maybe 20 pounds overweight. He'd had a heart attack, had a stent, and was freaked out, at 50 years old, to have his heart be at risk like that. And he was on a pile of medications when I saw him. He was on a statin, a beta blocker, blood thinner, calcium, the whole
cocktail,
blood pressure pills, pretty much everything. And I said, well, listen, are you willing to sort of make some changes? And so we totally revamped his diet. We got rid of all the junk out of his diet, very, very low sugar starch diet, lots of good fats, lots of fiber, got him on some basic supplements, B vitamins, folate, and also fish oil, got him on an exercise program. And over the course of a year, he lost, maybe he was more overweight. I think he lost almost 50 pounds. He was able to normalize all of his numbers, and his blood sugar was high. Yep. His insulin was high. He wasn't, quote, diabetic, but he was pre-diabetic. And no one, they completely missed it. Yep. It's just staggering to me that after 30 years that I've been doing this, that the literature has been there, that doctors don't check for pre-diabetes on a regular basis, which affects basically 1 out of every 2 Americans or more. And so you check that by measuring insulin, A1C, a glucose tolerance test with insulin. There's ways to look at it and look at particle number, particle size. And he lost the weight, and he was able to reverse all of his numbers, and he was able to get off all his medication, including statins. And his numbers were better off the statins than they were on it by fixing all these lifestyle factors. And he's been heart attack free for the last 20 years. Woohoo! So I think we are so stuck in this paradigm of treating the symptom, the cholesterol, instead of the cause.
Absolutely. That's critical. That's a
good story. You've had some patients too, right? So what?
Yeah. So, the first one, I wanted to bring up the 2 cases I wanted to talk about today were people with this in-between cholesterol, like where they really wanted to know what to do. They weren't crazy high risk, but they were told they should go on medication. And they came to me to say, well, is that the right decision, or what else can I do? So the first one was a 45-year-old gentleman who was told his cholesterol was too high. He didn't have a strong family history of heart disease, and but his total cholesterol was 225. His good cholesterol's HDL was 37,
which is low.
It's too low.
50, right?
His triglycerides were 185 fasting,
which is high, right? Should
too
be
high.
Ideally under 70.
And his LDLs were 145. So, his doctor said, what, I think you should start some medication. And he said, well, I want to see what else I can do. So he came to see us, which was great. And because, a lot of times with patterns like this, we can make a huge change. So we did that we did an NMR lipoprofile. So we looked at those particle sizes, and we saw that he had a lot of the small, dense LDL particles. His pattern, they sometimes give you a pattern. Are you pattern A or pattern B? Pattern B being the more concerning. You have too many small, dense LDLs, and that's what he had. He looked like he had a high risk for insulin resistance, which we knew even before we did the test, but because his waist to hip ratio was too high, his HDL was too low, his triglycerides were too high. So it was obvious, but that test confirmed that, right? It said you have a high risk for insulin resistance based on your cholesterol panel. And we also...
Before you go there, I just want to point out, because this is really a very easy, cheap way to check to see if you have insulin resistance. And it's a far better predictor of your risk of heart attacks than your LDL, which is your triglyceride to HDL ratio. And this guy had a ratio about 5. Right. If it's over 1... not great. If it's over 2, you're in trouble. He was 5.
Yes.
And that pattern of high triglycerides, low HDL is what you see in these patients with prediabetes, even though they might have a normal cholesterol. I mean, his was 225, but I've seen people with, a total of 150, triglycerides of 300, HDL of 29. I'm terrified for these patients, even though their total cholesterol is 150, and it sounds ideal.
Right. That's where we get really nervous, because we know that's such a pro-inflammatory process. And what we know about heart attacks, especially sudden heart attacks, right? There's typically, I always sort of draw this picture for my patients of the inside of the artery. And so often we think when somebody has a heart attack, the plaque just keeps building. They're 50% blocked, and then they're 90% blocked, and then they're 100% blocked, and they have a heart attack. But what we know is that sometimes you're only 30% blocked. But if that's inflamed, if that blockage is inflamed, kind of like that can rupture and then cause a significant blockage.
It's like a pimple popping that then your body protects by making a blood clot in your artery.
Right. And that's really often what we see when somebody has a sudden heart attack, right? That blockage is just ruptures. And so it's often missed. People aren't necessarily coming in with years of chest pain and, shortness of breath, those things that we see as people get older. They just have a sudden rupture of that plaque. So yeah, those are the situations you get really nervous. And a lot of times you see a lot of inflammation. So we also did an oxidized LDL with him, which was high and concerning.
That's the rancid cholesterol.
Yep, that's that rancid cholesterol. So, we really, for him, with all those signs of insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, the diet for him was that really low glycemic diet. We needed to work to lower those carbohydrates, to lower the sugar. We know that triglycerides really decrease when you cut out juices, sugars, alcohol.
And they're basically fats that are made in the liver when you eat sugar and starch, right?
Yes.
They're not produced by eating fat.
Nope, sugar. And you can lower your triglycerides pretty quickly when you pull out the alcohol, the juice, if some people doing too much fruit.
Flour and sugar.
Flour and sugar, absolutely. Sugar. So when you cut that out, you can bring your triglycerides down really pretty substantially, pretty quickly. So we really focused on lowering his carbohydrate load, all the bad carbs, right? And you also focus on giving him more of the omega-3 fats, because we know those omega-3 fats are really anti-inflammatory, and they can 2 to 4 grams of omega-3s a day can lower your triglycerides and raise up that HDL.
And this is FDA approved as a drug,
absolutely,
quote, a drug, which is fish oil, which is a prescription that you can buy to lower your triglycerides.
And you can get it from food, right? Like a can of sardines, 3 ounces of sardines has about 2 grams of the omega-3s in it.
That's what I'm having for lunch.
That's my favorite lunch, sardines on a salad with some walnuts. Very heart healthy. So we made that switch with his diet, and what was amazing and what I love to see is when in like 3 months, we repeated that NMR lipo profile, and he went from having too many of the small dense LDLs to having, he was now considered pattern A. He had more of the big fluffy LDLs. His HDL improved. Now, it wasn't yet optimal, but I think it got up to like 47 in 3 months. His triglycerides came down to 120. So maybe not, this was just 3 months of doing this. We can see really quick changes in people's bodies with making these changes in lifestyle, which is phenomenal.
Yeah, and I think one of the other thing I want to talk about, this is a great case, but you're able to change his diet and improve things, but one of the things that we're really bad at in medicine is personalizing care. And there's no place that's more important to personalize your care than dealing with your heart attack risk and cholesterol, because it's different for different people.
That's very true.
And what I've seen, I'm sure you've seen this over the years, is people respond dramatically differently to the same diet. So typically we're told by the American Heart Association that we should have less than 5% of our diet as saturated fat. Although breast milk is 25% saturated fat, so maybe we should ban breast milk according to the American Heart Association. I don't know about that, but it's really important to get saturated fat in your diet because it's a building block for cholesterol, and which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, your cholesterol makes your hormones, it makes the nerve coverings for your nerves, it's part of your brain.
Yep.
I mean, it's really important. A lot of your hormones are made from cholesterol, your sex hormones. And what I found is, depending on the person, their responses are very different to diet.
Yes.
And I've talked to Dr. Ronald Krause, who's one of the world's experts in cholesterol on this. And he says, there's a lot of heterogeneity. And I've seen this, just 2 cases come to mind. One was of a woman who was overweight, who was clearly pre-diabetic, whose triglycerides were 300, which is really high. It should be under 70. Her HDL was like 30, which is terrible. Her total was, probably, 250, 60. It was pretty high. A lot of small particles, a lot of overall particles, just way
metabolic
high.
syndrome.
Yeah. And she struggled with weight loss and diet. So I put her on a high saturated fat diet. Yeah. I put her on basically butter and coconut oil and almost a ketogenic diet. And it was striking. She never could lose weight. She dropped 20 pounds like that. Yep. Her cholesterol dropped 100 points. Her triglycerides dropped over 200 points. Her HDL went up 30 points. And you just can't get that result with a drug.
Nope.
And so I did that with her, and saturated fat was the cure for her cholesterol, not the cause. But another guy was this super fit, mid-50s biker, would bike 50 miles a day, super healthy. And his cholesterol wasn't great. And he had a genetic issue with his cholesterol and had this sort of more of these small particles. And so I put him on, I tried and said, let's try just do more of a ketogenic diet, see what happens, or more saturated fat. His cholesterol turned in terrible.
Yeah.
So we had to totally change gears and get him off saturated fat. And I think we'll soon be able to do a test, which is a cheek swab or a drop of blood, measure your genetics, and figure out which one are you. Are you somebody who should be eating more fat and saturated fat, or more carbohydrates, or more of the right foods, different kinds of fat? We're not quite there yet, but I think in functional medicine and here at the UltraWellness Center, we can, on an individual basis, really come to learn what is the right thing for this particular person.
That's
it's
so important. That's so important, because what's really key with diet is personalizing it, right? That's when we get the most benefit from, our nutrition intervention. And I think what you mentioned with the first woman, the reason you saw such an improvement with the ketogenic diet is you lowered her insulin so much, right? So we know that the carbohydrates that you eat cause your insulin to spike. So when your insulin is high and you can't lose weight because your insulin is high, because it's causing you to put on weight around the belly, when you change to a diet that doesn't cause your insulin to go up, which is like a ketogenic diet. I mean, that's the extreme, right? But you can do some things in between too. But then that insulin doesn't go up, and that's when we can see huge benefits for some people in that situation.
Yeah. It's really true. I mean, insulin, for the most part, and like the one guy, it wasn't because he was so fit.
Yep.
And there's genetic variations, but for most people out there, it is really the most common thing. And aside from getting the NMR particle test, getting a measure of your fasting insulin, really great. If you can get an insulin test after you have a sugar load, that's even better.
Yep.
Because by the time your blood sugar goes up, you're down the road, way down the road.
Yes.
I mean, it's a late stage phenomena. You even have your blood sugar going up fasting, and then 2 hours after a sugar load, it's, you see a little earlier. But, doing these tests for decades, I just see this pattern over and over again. Yeah. You can have perfectly normal sugar, I had this one woman who was really overweight, and she had a giant belly, and clearly she was metabolic syndrome. She had high triglycerides, low HDL, the same pattern. But when I measured her glucose tolerance test and her A1C, perfectly normal. Like her fasting blood sugar was normal. Her average blood sugar was normal. Her 1 and 2 hour blood sugar test, like normal. Like her fasting was in the 80s, after it was like 110. But I measured her insulin. Now, normal insulin should be under 5. If it's over 10, kind of in trouble. Her fasting insulin was like 30.
Yep.
And then we did a sugar load, and her insulin went up to 200, 250.
Yep.
And it should be under 30 after a sugar load. So she was like 10 times normal, and it was keeping her blood sugar normal, but it was driving all this weight gain and inflammation and abnormal cholesterol. So you really have to dig in a different way than your traditional doctors are digging in.
I think glyphosate has rapidly rose to kind of my number 2 mischief maker of all time. It's an antibiotic against the earth, in my opinion. It was actually patented by Monsanto as an antibiotic initially. And what we didn't know, what you and I didn't know, is that yes, it works with it works against the shikimate pathway, how plants make protein synthesis. And Monsanto said, don't worry, humans don't use this shikimate pathway, so you're safe, it can't hurt you. What they didn't bother to tell us was that bacteria and fungi use the shikimate pathway, so that when you swallow glyphosate, it actually kills off your microbiome rather effectively. Plus, recent evidence is that it in itself, without any other effect, is a gut wall disruptor. It breaks tight junctions. And in one paper, I show that glyphosate actually interferes with mitochondrial function. And that's actually not too hard to believe, because mitochondria, as your listeners know, are actually engulfed ancient bacteria. And they actually carry a bacteria signature, and they work as a functioning bacteria within all of our cells. So it's actually was not surprising as I was researching this to find out that, in fact, glyphosate affects mitochondrial function. Yeah. So it's everywhere.
I mean, it's on 70% of our agricultural crops. It's the most abundant agrochemical in use today. It's on over 90% of our corn, soy, and cotton. It's kind of scary. It's out there. It's really being looked at from the legal point of view. There's over 14,000 lawsuits pending against the herbicide, and I think, and that's for its human effect. But I think what you're speaking to is something really more important, which is its effects on the microbiome of the soil and also the microbiome of humans, and they're interconnected. And I think we literally are destroying the microbiome of the soil, which fills the organic matter and leads to increased greenhouse gas emissions from loss of soil carbon. And then you've got the microbiome effects on humans, which has all the consequences that you just talked about.
Yeah, you're right. We talk about you are what you eat, but you are what the things you're eating ate. Well, the same thing is true with plants. And plants, as you and I know, have this incredible rich soil microbiome that would normally assist in feeding the plant and allowing the plant to absorb nutrients. And now, because of glyphosate and other biocides, our soil is dead. And so we could have a plant that looks like bok choy or spinach, but it does not have the nutrients that it used to have. In fact, our soil is so depleted of the common nutrients that we need, like magnesium, for instance, that we don't have a chance.
No, it's huge. I mean, and the data on glyphosate is, people don't understand, it's just Roundup, used on Roundup Ready soybeans. It's not. It's used on 70% of crops, and it's 220 million pounds a year. That's used in the United States. I think since 1974, it's 1.6 billion kilograms have been used on crops in the United States alone. And it's on 70 different food crops, including corn, soy, canola. If you have a slice of bread, a bowl of Cheerios, a sushi roll, a plate of pasta, a slice of pizza, a chicken nugget, it's probably got Roundup on it. And it just, it's scary when you look at the work from the Environmental Working Group. Your Cheerios has more glyphosate per serving than vitamin D or B12, which actually have to be added to the cereal to enrich it. It's a big problem. And I think you're right. This understanding of its role in the microbiome is really quite important. So you've got antibiotics, glyphosate, and there's more chemicals that are a problem, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're surrounded with environmental toxins. One of the favorite old ones was BPA in plastics, and most of BPA has now been banned, but BPS looks to be even more mischievous than BPA. And these are endocrine disruptors, they're hormone disruptors. And one of the things people should realize is that estrogen, for instance, is one of the best fat storage hormones that's ever been invented. As any young woman in her teenage years knows, that estrogen is designed to make you store fat. And we now have chemicals that mimic estrogen, and we're awash in these things. For instance, phthalates, another very important plasticizer, is present in our food wraps, any plastic food wrap. So you may get your organic pastured chicken breast, and if it comes in a shrink wrap plastic, you'll actually pick up phthalates off of that plastic. And one of the really scary things is that there's really scary correlation between boys' penis sizes and the amount of chicken their mother ate during pregnancy, and it's a inverse relationship.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you mentioned environmental chemicals, and the couple that you haven't mentioned, these are the sort of we call persistent organic pollutants that are really petrochemical driven from oil derivative things, plastics, and so forth. But there's another class which is heavy metals, and for me, that was the massive driver of fatigue, and for many patients. So mercury, lead are the two biggest. And how do you think about those?
That's a great question. I look at mercury and lead and cadmium in a great number of my patients. I can tell you that the vast majority of people with high mercury levels in my practice are dentists and sushi eaters. Dentists for obvious reasons, sushi eaters hopefully for obvious reasons. But
mercury in the fish.
Yeah, mercury. One of the interesting things that at least I see is that heavy metals in general are contained in our fat cells. And it's like a tuna maybe have toxic levels of mercury, but that tuna is doing perfectly fine because the heavy metals are actually in the fat. It's when people have weight loss that we release those heavy metals from fat. And this was actually demonstrated by Ray Walford in Biosphere 2. You and I are probably old enough to remember Biosphere 2, the experiment in the Arizona desert where they locked everybody in a geodesic dome for a year to simulate a mission on Mars. And everybody had to grow their own food and produce their own food. And long story short, it was a horrible failure. People lost about 30% of their weight in 6 months. And one of the findings was that heavy metals and organopesticides went up precipitously, very rapidly, and stayed elevated for over a year before they went down. And it was because those heavy metals were there in these participants' fat cells. And we, as you know, have a horrible system for detoxifying heavy metals. Our liver does a horrible job of it, and they're excreted by our liver into our bile, thinking that we'll get rid of it through our stool, except we're really good at absorbing heavy metals out of our gut. So we actually set up a vicious cycle. So we excrete it and then pick it up. And as I talk about in the book, anyone who's actually on a weight loss program really should be supplementing with chlorella and activated charcoal during that time period, because they will complex with heavy metals. And knock on wood, we've been very effective with those two treatments in bringing down people's heavy metals without the need for chelation.
Yeah. I mean, chelation is a bigger term, but it's basically there's ways to upregulate your body's detox system and reduce the inputs. And I think it's so key. And you also mentioned drugs that disrupt your energy.
Yeah. You know, the big driver that I saw in plant paradox was NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. These drugs are actually one of the best ways to create leaky gut that anybody ever came up with. And this was known about by the drug companies when they were introduced in the 1970s. In fact, it was so well known that by law, you couldn't take these drugs for over 2 weeks period of time because they were so dangerous with that effect. Now, of course, we eat them like candy. And so anytime we produce leaky gut, we produce inflammation. And that inflammation in turn actually produces more pain. And if you have more pain, you'll take more of these drugs and the cycle continues.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I really urge people to do is get these seemingly harmless NSAIDs, ibuprofen, Aleve, naproxen out of their medicine cabinets. The second group in the same box are the PPIs, the proton pump inhibitors.
Yeah.
Now, to take people back to high school biology class, we actually make energy in mitochondria by pumping protons across the mitochondrial membranes. When proton pump inhibitors like Nexium, like Prilosec, like Protonix came out, they were a miracle in terms of the treatment of ulcers because we had something to stop stomach acid production. But like any good idea, when we then make them easy to obtain for the treatment of heartburn, what we didn't know was that these things were not specific for the proton pumps in the stomach. They affect all proton pumps, and proton pumps are what drive mitochondrial function. And when we poison the mitochondria in our heart, and specifically poison the mitochondria in our brain with proton pump inhibitors, it's no wonder that congestive heart failure strongly correlates with proton pump inhibitors.
Yeah.
Dementia strongly correlates with proton pump inhibitors, all for the sake of relieving heartburn.
Yeah.
So if you want to poison mitochondria, take a proton pump inhibitor.
That's an interesting framework. And we know it inhibits absorption of nutrients, and it can affect your GI function and cause irritable bowel and leaky gut, all kinds of problems. But the mitochondrial story is an interesting one that hasn't really been told. And I think, it all comes down to mitochondria, which is really what we're talking about in terms of energy, right? All these things affect the mitochondria, which are these little energy factories that take food and oxygen and burn them in your cells to produce energy. And all the things you're talking about will have adverse effects, all those chemicals, not only by affecting your microbiome, but also just directly affect on the mitochondria. And the key to really figuring out your energy is healing your mitochondria. And I think some of the shocking data about the microbiome, and I'd love if you could sort of draw this connection a little more, is how the microbiome affects the mitochondria. Because it's really the subject of your book. But I'd love you to sort of maybe tease that out a little bit. It's really all about how does the damage to the microbiome and the adverse metabolic gut compounds influence everything, including hormones or appetite, mood, brain function, weight, energy. But start with the mitochondria, because the idea is that the gut has all these bacteria and they get out of balance, and then bad stuff happens. So, and what happens?
So again, mitochondria are ancient engulfed bacteria, and they actually talk to their sisters, the gut microbiome, which for the most part are bacteria as well. In fact, we inherit our mitochondria from our mother. Our dad doesn't give us any. And we inherit, if things work out okay, our initial microbiome from our mother via birth, and also by being breastfed. Believe it or not, one of the huge benefits of breastfeeding is that a woman's breast milk has huge amounts of bacteria and fungi that are also populating the baby. Okay, so years ago, one of my first times presenting at the World Congress of Microbiota in Paris, I met the director, Marvin Endres, and he and I were talking. I had a paper on, and he says, I'm going to tell you something. He said, the microbiome talks to the mitochondria. And my eyes went up, and I said, well, how do they do that? And he says, well, we don't know yet, but I'm telling you, we're going to find out that the microbiome talks to the mitochondria because they're literally sisters. And I said, well, that's interesting. He says, yeah, they send text messages. Well, lo and behold, Marvin was right, because the language, what's called the trans-kingdom communication system of how the microbiome talks to mitochondria and to our DNA was discovered. And it's as big a discovery as the Enigma code discovery in World War II, the German code. So what that discovery is the discovery of postbiotics. And postbiotics, everybody knows probiotics, friendly bacteria. Most people are learning prebiotics, which are the fibers that friendly bacteria need to eat. But when those bacteria eat those fibers, they produce either short-chain fatty acids like acetate and butyrate, but more importantly, they produce gases, and they're called gasomessengers or gasotransmitters. And it's these messaging system that's now been discovered that actually tells mitochondria what to do, whether to make more energy when things are good or whether to throttle back because things are bad down in the engine room. And the whole discovery is like, holy cow, we are this incredible symbiotic organism. I mean, for instance, the Nobel Prize for discovering how nitric oxide works and where it came from, was awarded in 1998. And, for years in cardiac surgery and cardiology, we knew what nitric nitric oxide did, but we didn't know how it did it. But nitric oxide is a gaso messenger. But here's something really wild. So hydrogen gas is a gaso messenger. And part of the fermentation process of bacteria eating fiber is to produce hydrogen gas. And hydrogen gas is the world's smallest molecule, and it diffuses right across our gut wall. And one of the shocking things as I was researching this is if you look at patients with Parkinson's disease, they have a microbiome that does not make hydrogen gas, whereas people who don't have Parkinson's disease have a microbiome that produce hydrogen gas. And you can give patients with Parkinson's disease hydrogen water, and that's water that has hydrogen dissolved in it, and they will symptomically improve once they consistently start taking hydrogen water. And so, as I joke in the book, in Boy Scouts, what we used to do, we'd eat beans on the camping trip, and we'd have Bic lighters, and we'd actually literally light our farts with this blue flame.
I've seen that happen at a campfire a couple of times. Yep,
exactly. And that's hydrogen gas. And little did we know. So
methane too, maybe. I don't know.
Exactly. Well, it turns out methane is actually a gaso messenger as well as hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg smell. And for years, you and I were taught that hydrogen sulfide is a toxic gas. But we now know that the effect of hydrogen sulfide is that of a hormetic agent. And a hormetic agent is basically that which doesn't kill me, makes me stronger. So that no hydrogen sulfide is not good. A little hydrogen sulfide is good. A lot of hydrogen sulfide will kill you. So a little dab will do you of these things. And so getting back to your original question, the more we feed our microbiome, the foods that they can make these literally text messages that tell your mitochondria to produce energy, the better off we are. And again, you look at a tribe like the Hansas, who they eat about 165 grams of fiber a day. If we're lucky, the average American may eat 20, probably not. But they're a wash.
I think it's 8 is the average American.
Yeah, if we're lucky. And half of the fiber we eat is actually insoluble fiber, which is actually really bad for you in a lot of ways. So the long story short, we are so deprived of the energy producing compounds that are available to all of us if we'll just feed the microbiome what they need. And that's a big part of the book.
The energy. So a lot of the key is fixing your gut to get your energy back.
Yeah. The second key is we are overfed and underpowered. And what the heck does that mean? We, in general, Americans eat nearly 16 hours a day, almost continuously, from sunup until well after sundown. And we have what's called mitochondrial rush hour, which living in LA is easy to understand. But simplistically, our mitochondria can handle sugars, fats, and proteins. And we use a slightly different system for making energy from sugar, from fat, and from protein. And in the good old days, when we ate whole food, like you advocate and I advocate, these different components, sugars would arrive first in the mitochondria. They'd be followed by protein, sometimes later. And a long time later, they'd be followed by fats. And mitochondria have, if you will, basically a freeway, an energy-producing freeway. Now, when these things arrive in a staggered fashion, the freeway moves great. But what happens is with our modern diet, with processed foods, with ultra-processed foods, we have combined simple sugars, simple proteins, and easily absorbed fats that hit our mitochondria simultaneously. And the mitochondria actually can't handle all these. So we actually have stagnation in the energy producing highways. And we have systems on freeways. Okay, we're going to have traffic lights that's going to control the onslaught of all this. But we get mitochondrial gridlock. And I use the example. So, okay, let's have breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning. All of a sudden, you're slamming with all three of these components, and your mitochondria literally go into gridlock for 2 or 3 hours. You begin to get sleepy at 10 o'clock, and you say, "Oh, I need a little pick-me-up. I'll have, I'll have a donut and a cup of coffee." And once again, traffic gets slammed. By that time, it's lunch. We slam it again, and so this process of gridlock really never stops until we go to sleep. And even after we go to sleep, there's still 2 to 3 hours of backup, if you will, on the mitochondrial freeways. So our mitochondria really never have a chance. And in researching this book and trying this out on my patients, one of the things that was dramatic was that if I could lessen the period of time that you're asking mitochondria to handle food, the better off you're going to be, because they have a chance to recover and heal themselves, if you will.
What actually are all the things that are happening? Because you create a list of conditions that are related to poor blood sugar. What is the biology of what's happening when your blood sugar is out of control? What happens to your microbiome, to your immune system, to your brain, to your hormones? Take us through what actually happens in the body when you are eating the average American diet.
Yeah. So there's sort of 4 things that I think are kind of worth focusing on. There's the direct effects of high blood sugar. So you eat something and your blood sugar spikes, and then there's biological effects of that. And then there is a 4th thing, which is the long-term stuff. So in terms of those short-term things, like you drink a Coke and your blood sugar goes up from 75 milligrams per deciliter to 150 milligrams per deciliter. That blood sugar spike can cause glycation. It can cause oxidative stress.
Wait. What is glycation?
So glycation is the process where sugar just sticks to things in your body. It's actually just like sugar molecules sticking to things like fats and proteins and DNA, and that can cause dysfunction. It can cause those, cellular parts to be dysfunctional. And so that's an issue. We don't want that. It can generate inflammation immediately too. This huge surge of sugar is unusual for the body.
Yeah.
It's like, what is going on? Why is this big change, this sort of homeostatic shift happening? We don't want that. And then it can cause oxidative stress, which is sort of this reaction where your body's producing metabolic byproducts that are reactive and can be damaging to the cells. So these unpaired electrons that go around and want to bind with things. It's rusting, exactly. So big glucose spike, you can have immediate effects on oxidative stress, glycation, and inflammation. And then the 4th thing is this thing that's happening both immediately, but also really has cumulative effects, which is the insulin surge. So when you have that big glucose spike, your pancreas is releasing all this insulin to help you soak up the glucose out of the bloodstream into the cells so it can be processed and bring the glucose back down. Mm-hmm. And what can happen there in the short term is that if you've got a big spike, so that big up and down, the insulin can actually sometimes overshoot. It can actually do too good a job in soaking up all that glucose. And you can have what's called reactive hypoglycemia, which colloquially is known as the post-meal crash. So if you've had lunch and then after lunch feel tired and you want to have that second cup of coffee at 1 p.m. and maybe you feel a little bit more anxious, that might just be the fact that your blood sugar has gone up. You've released all this insulin. The insulin's kind of overshot. You've crashed down and now you're in this dip and the body's trying to get back into balance. And that roller coaster with
that creates
insulin,
a secondary cascade of hunger hormones,
cravings
and
exactly. And so that's happening in the short term. And then that insulin process, going back to what we were talking about before, can over time lead to that insulin resistance where the cells see that huge surge in insulin so frequently that they actually say,
we can't keep doing this. This is too much insulin, and we get numb to it. And that's insulin resistance. And then what happens is your insulin levels, they start creeping up because your body's trying to overcompensate for that block by producing more. And then that leads to so many of the downstream conditions that, we've been talking about. When you've got this high insulin, one of the secondary effects of that, we can talk about obesity. Insulin is a signal to the body that glucose is around for energy. And it's also a signal to the body that because there's so much glucose around, we don't need to use fat for energy. Glucose and fat are the two main ways that we produce energy in the body. And when that insulin's high, it blocks us from tapping in to fat burning. It says to the body, nope, you don't need to tap into fat burning. We've got a bunch of glucose around. And so this is relevant to anyone who is trying to lose weight or who has the excess belly fat, because that insulin is a real block on helping us achieve those goals. And so for us to tap into our copious fat stores in our body, we need the insulin to be lower. So by getting off that glucose roller coaster, by eating foods that keep us more flat and stable throughout the day, which is what we want for optimal health, both in the short term and the long term, we give our body a break from producing that insulin, and that can have a real significant impact on our ability to lose weight, to kind of get rid of that belly fat, to tap into this alternate metabolic fuel source, and to generate what we call metabolic flexibility, which is this ability of the body to flip between using glucose when it's around and using fat when it's not around. And that state of being able to do both is a really healthy state. It's adaptive, but the average American, with the vast majority of our calories coming from ultra processed foods, and I believe more than 70% of processed foods in the US have refined sugar in them. And we've been told, of course, to eat 6 small meals a day. You are on, as an American, this up and down glucose roller coaster all day. And so you're really never giving your body this time in a low insulin state. So you really do have to be quite aware and think differently. I mean, the reality is, as an American adult, you're on a treadmill towards being overweight and chronic disease. And unless you are doing something different, you will end up sick. And that's where having a little more awareness, I think, can be helpful.
100%. And all the things you mentioned earlier, people don't relate to this. They don't relate to blood sugar. They get diabetes is related to blood sugar, but what about cancer and Alzheimer's and depression and heart disease and so many other issues, infertility, gout you mentioned, sexual dysfunction, acne, just whatever, it's just unbelievable how much of our modern ailments and how many of those ailments are driven by this single process.
Right.
And you don't have to treat all these diseases separately. If you dealt with that, then these other things would get better. And I think it's something that I don't know why, but it's just such a dark black hole in medicine. There's a lot of literature on it. There's no lack of science, but in practice, the average doctor doesn't know how to diagnose or treat insulin resistance. One of my patients came to me and said, my doctor's, I saw his blood sugar was like 115 or something. I'm like, hey, your fasting blood sugar is a little high. You're heading towards diabetes. He's like, yeah. I said, has your doctor recommended anything? And he's like, well, yeah. I said, what? He said, wait till it gets to be higher and then they'll put me on medication. And I'm like, wow, okay. That is not a very enlightened understanding of how our bodies work. And the biological processes are so central to every age-related disease. I was at a longevity conference once, and I was walking with Leonard Guarte, who was from MIT and discovered sirtuins, which are these incredible regulators of our mitochondrial function, our energy, which we were talking about earlier, and that are so important in longevity and aging. And I said, so what's the secret? Like, how do they work? And this was years ago. And I was like, the data was just starting to come out. He says, it's sugar. I'm like, don't eat sugar. It's like, that's what's causing these systems to fail and for us to age and for all these chronic ailments. And most people listening are probably, well, I'm not diabetic. I'm like, all right, why should I worry about it? Well, if you have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, if you have any belly fat, if you're even thin but you eat a crappy diet, this is going on under the hood.
Yeah.
And so tell me why you feel that continuous glucose monitoring, which is sort of part of this whole new movement of what we call biosensors or quantified self or portable metrics, that people have the scales that send their data up to the cloud, or blood pressure cuffs or the Oura Ring or
Yeah.
Fitbits or now the continuous glucose monitors. Why are these important, and why should the average person even care? Because if you're not diabetic or pre-diabetic, which most people don't know, by the way, that they're pre-diabetic because doctors don't diagnose it, but why should people care?
Yeah. So I think that we've touched a little bit on why probably more people should care than, they maybe realize. With 88% of American adults having metabolic dysfunction, this is relevant to the vast, vast majority of us. But I really think it comes down to personal empowerment and really understanding our own bodies. We're not going to fix healthcare without fixing health. And you can't fix health without fixing the decisions that we're making every day about what we're eating, how we're sleeping, how we're stressing, how we're moving, how we're supporting our microbiome, all these things. And so it really comes down to choices. And right now, we don't have a lot of help to understand what choices to make for our own body. And that's where wearables, and especially bio wearables, I think can be very, very helpful. I'm not the type of person who wants to be strapped to technology for the rest of my life. That's not really it's not my goal to, be a cyborg and be wearing a sensor, but I want to be unplugged in the backcountry, right? Like camping. However, the reality is that the system that we're living in right now is designed to hurt us. It's designed to keep us sick. It's designed to keep us dependent and, coming back, for medications and surgeries and whatnot. So in the world we're living in, where our taxpayer money is going towards subsidizing refined sugar and refined corn and wheat and disease-causing foods, I think we need a little bit extra support. And I think that wearables can really help with that. Yeah. And so that's where I'm really passionate about this is the empowering people to understand their own bodies and to make decisions for themselves in the face of a healthcare system that isn't being really proactive about metabolic health. We, like you were mentioning with your patient, those numbers, when we reach sort of the pre-diabetic or diabetic threshold, it's likely that we've probably had issues going on with our insulin for 13 years, is one study from the Lancet showed that. Sure. 13 years before we get that diagnosis. So how can we as individuals have tools that can help us during this time? I mean, if you can keep your blood sugar in a stable and healthy range throughout your lifetime, I'm fairly confident that you're never going to walk into a doctor's office one year and get a huge bomb dropped on you that you have a metabolic condition. If you're looking day after day, year after year, and knowing that what you're putting in your body is not causing these huge spikes, you have unlocked the door to essentially minimizing your risk drastically of all of the conditions that are killing Americans. And 8 of the 10 leading causes of death in the US are directly related to blood sugar.
Absolutely.
And so that's...
And the cost and the suffering and the on and on and on.
Right. And so I think having a tool in the face of the modern world that we're living in can be great. And I also think that from what I've seen with my patients, when you really understand your body and understand how the environment is affecting your body, it's very motivating. Yeah. Nutrition has kind of been a black box. It's always been an open loop system where you make a choice and you actually don't really understand what the result is, often for a long time. Maybe you eat healthy one day and then the next day you step on the scale. That's kind of the lagging indicator. How do you create a relationship between what specific food led to that result? Maybe it's 6 months from now, you get a blood sugar test or a cholesterol test, but that one-to-one relationship has been missing. Mm-hmm. And now it's not with these bio wearables. So for me, for instance, I was eating oatmeal for breakfast semi-frequently.
You just hadn't read my Ultra Metabolism book then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the box literally says heart healthy on it and good source of whole grains and fiber. Mm-hmm. I ate it with a continuous glucose monitor on, and my blood sugar, and I'm talking plain oatmeal, 0 sugar, 0 fruit, 0 juice, plain, boring oatmeal. My glucose went up about 85 points.
Oy, wow.
For me, there is no chance that food is heart healthy for me, because glycemic variability, these ups and down swings like that. I mean, I never really want my glucose to go above 20 to 30 points above my pre-meal levels.
Right.
This was like 80. So for me, it is not a heart healthy food. And anecdotally, for most of our members at Levels, it's also not a heart healthy food. We've seen very few people. And, if you look at the advertisements for this food, almost universally, it's the oatmeal with brown sugar, with fruit, with OJ, maybe with a piece of toast. I can't even imagine. I think that's where some of this technology can really help. And I think it honestly can also improve the relationship between the doctor and the patient. I think this is not like people going to Dr. Google and coming in with a bunch of, theories and questions. This is real information. It's real objective data. And I think it kind of can equalize that playing field and that power dynamic between the doctor and the patient. I think sometimes doctors will recommend things and patients will try them and it doesn't work. Their labs don't get better. They don't lose weight. And there can be a lot of frustration. There can be some mistrust. But if you can use a wearable to help personalize and almost be like a coach to help you achieve your goals, that can be great. And the reality is that 49% of Americans every year try to lose weight. So people are trying.
And probably 75% should be.
Right. Right. But that's hundreds of millions of people who are trying, who are making the mental commitment to, I want to do the work. I want to do better. I want to try. And we don't have much to grasp onto to help us. And so I'm very passionate about how we can, for all these people who want to do better, give some tools, sort of a lifeline.
Yeah, and here's the secret that most people don't understand, especially around weight, is that the key to losing weight is low insulin.
Right.
Not necessarily low blood sugar, but low insulin.
Right.
Because insulin locks the calories and the fat in your fat cells.
Yeah.
It's like a one-way turnstile. So once the glucose gets into your fat cells in your belly, it can't get out if the insulin's high, which people don't realize. And so the key really to weight loss is in addition to addressing all these chronic diseases, is to really get the insulin low. And the tool of Levels, which is just an amazing technology that helps people in real time track their blood sugar, correlate it with what they're eating, with their activity, with their stress, with their exercise. It gives them a sort of a window into their biology that we really haven't had before. And we're just going to get better and better at it. Can I ask you, Casey, tell me from the people who've used it, because now it's in beta, right? It's not quite out, and it will be soon. By the way, for people listening, there's a closed beta happening now, but there's a wait list of over 120,000 people who want to sign up. If you want to skip the line, you came to the right place, because all you have to do, because you listen to this podcast, is get early access through going to levels.link/Hyman. That's levels.link/Hyman to get to be part of the wait list, top of the line. So you get to cut the line. So in all the people who've used it, tell me, what are some of the cases that just were the most instructive, the things that you learned from people's experience? You mentioned a few things, I've mentioned a few things, but give us some real patient stories.
It has been so exciting to see what our members are learning by putting these continuous glucose monitors on and using Levels. Some of the most, fascinating things. I mean, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, right? It's like, if you drink a soda, your blood sugar often goes through the roof. So these are sort of the obvious ones. But then there's sort of the not.
Well, what's really interesting is that, sorry to interrupt you, but I just remember the study in New England Journal years ago where they looked at first degree relatives of type 2 diabetics who were actually healthy. And when they did a challenge with them, they found that they had higher spikes of sugar and insulin than people who didn't have first degree relatives. So even if you look thin and great, you still might be headed there, right? If you're not careful. If you're a Pima Indian, even if you were living 100 years ago, if you had a can of Coke, you're going to be in trouble.
Definitely.
And that's how they got to be the second most obese population in the world after Samoans.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I think even those simple learnings can be really helpful, because we kind of know we shouldn't drink soda, although most Americans do. But you walk into the grocery store and it's everywhere, and it's subsidized by our government. And you might get the impression like, oh, well, if it's subsidized by the government and it's covering Safeway, like it's probably okay. But then you see the data and you're like, oh wait, it's definitely not okay. This is going, way out of range. So, but then it gets into some of the more nuanced and exciting stuff. So one big learning is people realizing that the importance of balancing their meals. And what I mean by that is adding fat, protein, and fiber to their carbohydrates. So people will, eat, let's say, an apple all by itself and have like a pretty significant glucose spike. But they take that apple and they put some almond butter and some chia seeds on it, and they might have a very different response because we know that additional fat, protein, and fiber from the chia seeds and the nut butter can actually, slow the time to absorb the glucose. And it can really change the dynamics. It also impacts the microbiome. And so may even make us absorb less of the glucose because we are putting fiber in there. So that's been a major thing that we've seen is fat, protein, and fiber.
We call that the glycemic load.
Right.
Which is what is the total effect of the meal.
Yeah.
And even the timing, right? Have you learned about what happens when people eat what?
Yeah, exactly. The timing has been a huge thing. We've seen that people often find that if they eat something very late at night versus the exact same meal earlier in the day, they'll often have a larger response at night, and it can impact their sleep quite a bit.
Even if it's the same meal.
Exactly. Same meal. And part of this is because we're a little bit more insulin resistant at night naturally. And this has to do with melatonin secretion to help us.
So we should have dessert earlier in the day?
Basically, I would say that if people are going to eat dessert,
not breakfast.
I do tend to now front load my carbs because of in the day, because of what I've learned from continuous glucose monitoring. And I also know that those up and down swings called glycemic variability at night can really impact sleep. And we integrate our glucose data stream with sleep and activity tracking so you can start to make some of those higher level insights about how sleep and glucose are related. We've seen a lot of people comment on how when they get less sleep, their glucose is quite a bit more erratic the next day. Yeah. It's a huge impact. Sleep. Massive,
exercise,
sleep, and then of course exercise. So one of the biggest takeaways is people realize that just getting up and walking for 15 minutes after a meal can have a significant effect on your post-meal spikes. It can bring your glucose down faster. And if you look at a lot of traditional cultures, getting up and taking a stroll, it's super common. And now we have the, biometric data to back up why it makes a big difference. So, and the last one I think that's been really interesting and again supported by the research is that stress definitely causes people's glucose spikes to be higher. We've had people who are fasting, it's first thing in the morning and they have to give a talk to their company or they're on a podcast or something like that, and they might get a glucose spike just from the stress alone. And the mechanism of that is really interesting. The cortisol and the catecholamine hormones that are released when we have stress, they tell our liver to actually dump glucose into the bloodstream. And evolutionarily, the purpose for this was because when we had a stress signal, like a threat, we thought, oh, we're probably gonna have to run from something. We're gonna have to run from the lion or whatnot. And so the body was like, okay, cool. You need to use your muscles. So we're gonna help you mobilize some glucose from the liver to feed the muscles. But now what we're dealing with are mostly these psychological stressors, an email, a honking horn, a stressful phone call, whatnot. And so that glucose from the liver is not actually helping us. It's just sitting in the bloodstream causing problems. So what I'm loving seeing in our members is that this is not just about, okay, put on a glucose monitor and eat low carb and get a flat glucose line. It's about having a holistic picture of your health and all these different lifestyle behaviors that feed into building a body that processes food effectively. And that includes the amount we sleep, how we're responding to stress, how we're moving throughout the day, of course, how we're pairing and timing foods. And all together, those things can sort of work to let us have a better glucose response.
If you love that last video, you should check out the next one for sure on getting to the root cause of all disease. There's so many things that drive inflammation, and if you're overweight, you're inflamed. Most of our chronic illnesses start in the gut.
You need to address the inflammation in your brain in order for you to lose weight.